get started. We'll still have some people coming. So I want to welcome everybody. This is one of our semi-annual courses that we give through our Aquatic Academy. And this one is called Stumbling Towards Sustainability. And as in all of these courses, we bring in a wonderful lineup of experts to talk about different important topics. This particular session is sponsored by the Metropolitan Water District. And we're going to do it a little bit differently than we did in the past. So this is somewhat of an experiment. It's going to be a combination of a course. Now, here's a guy from Southern California, Edison. How can I count on you to keep my lights on? Hello, Bob. It's an experiment. It's going to be a combination of a course, a conversation, and a dialogue. Conversations and dialogues are different. Conversations are when you talk, you listen, and you modify your response. But often in a conversation, you are trying to convince someone of something, to change their opinion. In dialogue, the objective is only to gain mutual understanding of different viewpoints. So in this particular course, we decided we were going to keep it small. We want to exchange ideas. We want to find out what you think and what our experts think on some of these big issues that are very important in achieving sustainability. And conversations and dialogues, because they have different goals, are often in conflict. So why the title, Stumbling Towards Sustainability? We think that, I think, that many of our efforts to achieve sustainability are not probably the best strategies to get us there. We often take a couple of steps forward and we get off track, and then we often go a couple of steps backward. And so I think the other thing, it isn't that what we're proposing is wrong often, but we fail to embed them in a larger set of strategies and tactics that are going to work in the larger context. And if you remember the old saw in terms of making money, that you can't save your way to prosperity, I think in sustainability, the comparable statement would be, we can't conserve our way to sustainability. If you want to get rich, you have to save, and if you want to achieve sustainability, we also have to conserve, but in both cases, those may not be enough. So we need to start with a definition of what we mean by sustainability. And sustainable development was defined by the Brundtland Commission in 1987, and it's the definition that is used most frequently. Sustainable development was defined as development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And some environmentalists object to that definition because they object to the word development being included in it. But development is key to having sustainability, in my opinion, because there are a lot of people living on the planet right now who live under such terrible conditions that we will never achieve sustainability unless we can get them to a better state of life. There are three pillars of sustainability: social, environmentally, and economic. If you don't like the Brundtland definition, another definition is that sustainability is improving the quality of human life while living within the carrying capacity of supporting ecosystems. Improving the quality of human life while living within the carrying capacity of supporting ecosystems. And the Earth Charter speaks of a sustainable global society founded on respect for nature, universal human rights, economic justice, and a culture of peace. So I want to pause and ask, do these definitions capture what all of you think of in terms of sustainability? And if they don't, what's missing? Improving the quality of life while living within the carrying capacity. development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs, or a global society founded on a respect for nature, universal human rights, economic justice, and a culture of peace. Did those capture what you think of sustainability and sustainable development when you think of it?
Those are kind of Western thoughts, Western advanced society thoughts. You look at 2 billion people that live on less than $1 a day in the world, and they don't care about sustainability, they care about survival.
But see, that's why though, sustainability is improving the quality of human life while living within the carrying capacity of supporting ecosystems. See, I would agree with you. We've got an awful lot of people.
It's a weighting factor.
It's a weighting factor.
Weighting factor.
That's right.
None of those give any weight to the rights of non-human.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, but within the carrying capacity of supporting ecosystems, it's implicit. You're in competition with nature.
I'm in competition with a gorilla, but I personally think a gorilla has a bunch of rights to the planet designed to.
Even in downtown Long Beach, we have some here. Right?
It's just there's no, that it's all to human service.
Okay. So maybe then what we need to do is incorporate a greater than respect and more attention to other forms of life. Way in the back, you were going to say something.
A couple things. In terms of the timeline, I know that one of this said future generations, but are we talking about millennia? Are we talking about centuries? Are we talking about decades? And then on top of that, with the carrying capacity to be changing because population is increasing exponentially, how do you calculate the carrying capacity 100 years from now?
Well, first of all, if it's sustainable, presumably it works for a variety of timelines. It works for not only the present generation, the next generation, the generation after that, and so on. And if it doesn't, then it is not truly sustainable.
So it's going to be a question mark because we don't know what the population is going to be in the future, the human population.
No, but we would have to anticipate. If we look at population trends, most of the estimates say we're going to get to 10 billion people by year 2100. And are we on a track that would allow them to meet their needs? Lots of people don't even meet their needs now, as we've already seen. So we're going to add a greater dimension then in terms of respect for other living things. If we do that, this is capture for most of you what you think of as sustainability. Bruce?
The UNESCO Rome Commission on Environment and Development mentions all of the things that you have mentioned, but makes it personal with individuals as well as societal and governmental. It says a change among them. I'm reading out of context.
Don't read too much, Bruce.
I'm hoping to read 5 words.
I think I'm coming.
All right. Changing personal attitudes and practices. And enabling communities to care for their own environment. So it goes beyond hoping that what we do will be neutral or positive to an action program every generation.
And I think that's not inconsistent at all with what I read. That would be one of the ways that you would modify development so that we could meet our needs and it would not affect future generations' ability. So it takes personal actions, it takes actions by communities, by governments at all levels, and now since we live in a global society, we're going to have actions that are international, global. All right, can we use that as our working definition as we go through this? Okay, now my working hypothesis is that the 2 biggest classes of activities engaged in by human beings that have the largest impact on the ability of future generations to meet their needs are first, the kinds and amounts of energy we use, and second, the ways in which we produce and harvest our food. you say that these are both forms of consumption, and they are, so you might argue it's really overconsumption. The trouble is, but when you make it that broad a category, it doesn't get you very far. Is it because that Bob likes to buy beautiful sweaters that are expensive, and I like I like sport coats.
Yeah.
My hypothesis is energy and food. Who wants to distribute? Yes, go ahead.
What about the waste products that human beings create and controlling that and which I guess comes from the ecology of what we have.
Oh, good point. So there are waste products, they result from human activities, and they result from the patterns that we have of consumption.
And the waste products include energy, which is usable then as one of the types.
Right.
So it fits in your category 1.
Right. And I think even when I look at the waste products worldwide, CO2 is a waste product, and it is changing the atmosphere and the ocean. And when I look at agriculture, the largest single problem that we have in the ocean is not oil spills. It is too many nutrients coming in from agriculture, causing eutrophication or over-fertilization. So again, I think most of the waste products are the ones actually that are having the most offensive, large-scale impacts fall into these two categories. Now, we create lots of hazardous waste, and they're not trivial, I don't mean that. I think they're more localized generally than these two. Well, you could argue, well, but it's really overpopulation. And I would agree with that, too. Getting the population under control is a long-term strategy, and I think that if you think about people, though, no matter how many there are, it still is the kinds of energy we use and the ways we grow our food and harvest our food, whether it's on land or in the ocean. Okay, now I'm going to pause and I'm going to ask you, when you think of a sustainable future, if you think ahead a number of decades, what would be some of the qualities that you would like to associate with a sustainable future? What would the world look like in 30, 50, 100 years that would be sustainable conditions in terms of quality of life? Your gorillas have like a couple to the city council? No.
I have a far out comment.
Okay, what's your far out comment?
I look to a government in which is governed for the good of the people and the good of the environment, and not for the good of the political parties that the person represents. Because I don't think that you're going to achieve very much until our politicians start to govern for the good instead of their party.
Okay. What else should I put up there, James?
I put there, all humans, especially women, have control over their bodies and their reproduction and have the option of healthcare. And that would go under the zero population growth.
You know, women's education is the biggest population control entity there is in town.
No, it's not. It's the men who are in politics who control women's education and their reproduction.
That's right.
Okay, but it is true that the best birth control mechanism is educating women and giving them equal
Give them
opportunities.
alternatives.
Give them alternatives. Right. Larry, what would you add?
Enough education universally to not only sustain life, but enjoy it.
Anybody else want to add something? You already got one. Yes, go ahead.
Sure, you didn't mention production as a whole, and I agree that food is an issue, but I think we need to define our happiness by the quality of our life, not by what we have.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Yesterday, I was invited to give talks at Disney for the release of the new film Oceans, and Margaret and I were there, and we gave 2 talks to the cast at Disneyland that was broadcast to Disney World. And one of the points that I made was that I think if we ever are to achieve sustainability, we have to redefine how we measure success. It can't be in terms of possessions, whether it's larger homes and cars and all of those things. There have to be different metrics by which we measure our own success and the success of people we admire. So I would totally agree. Anybody want to add? Yes, go ahead.
Well, looking at the bigger picture, I would say that we need to redefine how we develop products that go to the marketplace and how we look at architecture and we look at the, how we process material at the end of their useful life, because I know over 50%, probably 80% of what we purchase today is in the landfill in 6 months. So we need to design products with their end of life recycling in mind, because right now, even though we recycle a lot,
Right.
there's materials, maybe not in this room, but for example, the steel of a car, you can't separate the paint from the steel, so they're downcycling. I've done a little reading on this, so, you know, we need to redefine the way we produce material.
And you're right, but this room is a LEED Platinum room, so that the things all that are in here are recycled or reused, and in the floor, for example, instead of using aggregate, it's fly ash from a power plant and so on. So we can do that. There.
I'll buy another book. I'm trying to figure out how to formulate, redefine happiness or enjoyment. That's part of my education, and that everybody else is nipping at it too. But it's not just success. You don't do things just to be successful and show your neighbor how successful you are. That's part of it. But you do things just because. And the education was part of learning how to do other things that are not so. It's not just consumption.
Right.
Unlearn consumption. How's that?
Well, you know, it's interesting that we've had a couple of speakers here at the Aquarium within the last year who have done research on happiness, and it has become actually a field of research. And among the findings are that the people who are happiest are involved in things bigger than themselves. That whether they are volunteers or working for organizations that have lofty missions, people who are giving of their time, their talents, and their efforts and finances to which they can, to the extent they can afford it, do things. The William Lyon Phelps was a professor of English at Yale University a long time ago. He used to play golf with my dad. And if you Google William Lyon Phelps, he was never a great scholar, but he was a great teacher. And he wrote these books, What I Like in Poetry, What I Like in Prose. And he wrote one little book called Happiness. And in that book, he makes the statement, the happiest person in the world isn't the wealthiest, it's not the handsomest or the most beautiful, it isn't even the healthiest. The happiest person in the world is the person who thinks the most interesting thoughts. And then he went on to talk about, if that's true, then as we get older, we should become happier because we're capable of thinking more interesting thoughts because we've had more experiences, etc. Now, I particularly like that definition of happiness. We have to move on here. Anyone? Yeah, but
to add to that list, I would like to see something about freedom from the fear of not having a roof over your head, not having adequate water supply or energy to take care of your needs.
Fear of losing security.
Yeah, Yeah, the basic essentials of life.
Maslow's basement.
Okay, well, that's a good one to end on, I think. We're gonna keep moving along. So what I want to, now if we could have those, Stacy, how do I get to that first slide? Because that leads in what we're gonna talk about here. And we're gonna get to energy pretty quick. All right. So we already looked at that. This was my working hypothesis. It's been modified a little bit by all of you, but I think we still all agree that these belong on the list, and we might add another couple. Population, just to put it in perspective, that two things I'd like you to take away. The developed regions of the world haven't changed their population very much in the last 50 years, and they won't for the next 100 years. If the developing region of the world, those are the ones where population is growing most rapidly. Those are the places where women do not have the rights and opportunities in education, and where lots of people live below the poverty line. But it isn't just there. In Los Angeles County, every night, almost 100,000 people sleep on the streets in Los Angeles County, in one of the wealthiest areas in the United States. That's not sustainable. Okay, so we have a population with lots of people, too many people, and the population continues to grow. There are a few countries where now the population growth has gone negative, and there's not a large enough population birth rate to maintain the population. That's true in Russia, it's true in Japan. The United States has the most rapidly growing population of any developed nation in the world. And it's a combination of a high birth rate and a large rate of immigration. All right, so one of the ways you can look at this is a comparative indicator of the aggregate of human impacts. It's called the ecological footprint. And it's the area of productive land and ocean that it takes to support your personal lifestyle, to supply the materials you use, and to absorb the waste you produce. So the point that you made about waste. Individuals have different ecological footprints, communities have different ecological footprints, states and nations all have different ecological footprints. And Earth, let me put all of these up, I want to talk very. So Earth has 22 billion productive acres of land. If you call that A, current population about 6.8 billion, maybe 6.9. That's B. If you divide A by B, each of us is entitled to about 3 acres per person if it were a fair Earth, everything distributed equally. In 2100, Earth's population is expected to be 10 billion. A fair share then would be about 2 acres, so you still have the same number of productive acres of land, maybe a little less with sea level rise, but you divide 22 billion by 10, and you get 2.2 acres per person. So our fair share is going down, and we're not making any more real estate, we're losing some. Currently, the globally average footprint is more than 6 acres per person. So we're only entitled to something like 3, and we're on average throughout the world, we're using 6. Some people are using a fraction of 1, and some of us are using much more than 6 or 8 or 10. All right, this is humanity's ecological footprint. Over here is the number of planet Earths that would require to sustain Earth plotted against time, and you can see as long as it stays below 1, since we only have 1 Earth, then you're okay. But starting about here in 1988 or something like that, we exceeded the carrying capacity of Earth. Now, a lot of people would argue, but we can increase the productivity through agriculture and so on. But again, go back to those two problems that we have. There is no activity on this planet that has done more damage to the ocean than agriculture. Global warming is beginning to because of ocean acidification. But once we cross that line, and you can argue that it didn't happen until out here, I think most people agree that at least we are north of that line and we are exceeding the carrying capacity of the Earth, and it is continuing to grow. So we're now somewhere out there we need about 1.25 planets to sustain life as we know it. And a lot of people would put this, the Environmental Defense Fund, I think, puts this at 3 planets. And I don't know whether it's 1.5 or 2 or 3, but we've exceeded it. Rob?
For the quality of life in the West, if everybody lived like we do, you need 4.
But see, it all depends. Yeah, all depends. That's right. All depends. And is our quality of life really better than, say, Western Europe? They have a much smaller ecological footprint. Is our quality of life better than Norway, Sweden, Denmark?
In a lot of ways, no.
I don't think so. It's better than Bangladesh. It's better
India's
than,
better than Bangladesh.
it's better than most parts of Africa. All right, we have to keep going. So where people live matters, and this is the aerial shot you've seen of the Earth that you're all very familiar with. And there's a 3-dimensional chart of the United States. And there's Los Angeles, there's Miami, Chicago, New York City, Boston. Joe was raised in the Midwest, in Indiana. I'm from Michigan. There's this whole area of the United States largely going to waste. We could put all of our waste and our nuclear power plants, everything, use that area, right? Probably not. Probably not. Probably not. But we like to live near the margins. The quality of life is greater. And so we cluster along the coastlines. And population in the coastal zone in the US, it's now nearly 66% of the total US population. Worldwide, it's more than 50. California, it's more than 80. And the percent and the absolute numbers are increasing. Coastal population in 2050, it will be 70% of the total in the world. That's pretty remarkable when you think of it. Population will be 10 billion. Population now is about 6.8. So 10% of 10 billion is 10 billion. It's a billion. And we're going to, it's equivalent to taking the, what did I say?
Entire population.
If you take the entire population and add a couple 100,000 to it within the next 40 years and move them to the coast. Can you imagine what will happen to our coastal and ocean environments when we do that, if we don't change the dynamic? So we've already looked at what that's equivalent. Urbanization, most of the scholars predict that 90% of population growth will be in cities. Does that help us with sustainability or work against us? You go, could be either way.
Could be either way.
Could be either way. I think in general, if we plan cities properly, it will help us. When I was young in college, we believed the best thing was low-density zoning. I lived in Maryland at the time, and we were advocating 2- and 5-acre lots throughout the Chesapeake Bay Drainage Basin, and we were totally wrong. Absolutely, totally wrong. We now know that if we had put those people in cities and kept most of the space so open for nature, we would have been a lot better off, and that's beginning to happen. So megacities, cities of more than 10 million people, we had 2 in 1950. What would those 2 have been in 1950?
Shanghai and Mexico City.
No, not in 1950. In 1950, New York and London. We had 25 in the year 2000, and only 5 of those were in the developed world. So 20 out of the 25 in 2000 were in the developing world, and 13 of the 15 are near the coast. So population is increasing, it's moving to the margins, and it's congregating, aggregating in cities. The largest migration in the history of humanity is now taking place in China, and the movements from the countryside into the cities. People go to cities in search of better conditions, better education, more opportunities, etc. And right now, those opportunities do not exist, and one of the results of that always is greater social unrest, and that's probably going to happen. Population density, Tokyo is twice New York City, Bombay 11 times New York City, Hong Kong 21 times. How about here in our great Los Angeles area? How do we rate?
10%?
Our,
Quarter?
it's terrible. Now, the way the statistics get reported though, if you use the whole greater Los Angeles area, population density is high because it's spread over a much larger area than say New York and the 5 boroughs. But if you look at the core central part of Los Angeles, the population density is way low, and it causes all of this, us to travel too far, back and forth on freeways and so on, and it really is a problem. We've already dealt with this. How people live matters. Lots of people in this world are poor, very poor. You can walk around even Long Beach and you can see people going through garbage and looking for bottles and cans and even for food. It really is tragic to think in the United States so many people do not have places to live, food to eat, and so on. So in the unplenitude, which is in the southern hemisphere, and which is also where most of the world's biodiversity is, this is where most of the poverty is. And so if you look at it from the perspective of the environment, we stand to lose much of the world's biodiversity unless we can figure out how to elevate the lifestyles of the people who live there. Los Angeles, the ways we live, the lawns, green grass in Southern California, over 75% of the water use in Southern California is used for landscaping in the home. Do we really all need to have green grass lawns, Kentucky bluegrass? We just planted a drought-resistant garden out in front of the aquarium to show people that those kinds of plants, or the one California native out here, they can be quite beautiful, and you can save money, and you can also save nature. And one of the other things about those kinds of lawns is, in gardens, is they create habitat for butterflies and birds, and we can enhance wildlife. How we shop, how much we shop, is also a role. The kinds of cars that we drive. I won't pick it. I won't pick it. The houses that we live in make a difference, and nobody wants to live in that. Remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs back when we were in junior high and high school? And the point was that until you can get people out of Maslow's basement, somebody mentioned we have to be able to meet the needs, physiological needs, places to live, food to eat, and unless you can get people out of that basement, you're not going to care about endangered species and biodiversity and all of the rest of this. We talk about saving the earth. The more important challenge is to save people so that people can help us save the earth. It doesn't work the other way around because we have too many in the population who just are living down here. So, major contributions to the size, the energy we use, how it's generated, the water we use, the car we drive, the home we live in, our landscaping, the food we eat, the clothes we wear. And if you look at some relative ecological footprints, these are all to scale. US, Western Europe, Asia Pacific, and the world. Is our ecological footprint, in a relative sense, too large? No. I would certainly think that it is. Quality of life in Western Europe is at least as good.
Are there any statistics for that footprint size for different urban areas around the planet?
Yes, and I can't remember offhand, but the answer is yes. So the challenge for us ought to be then to reduce that. So we are a leader. If you look among all of the countries, we use more water than any other nation, even more than in Egypt on a per capita basis, and they've got a lot of agriculture going on. Number 2, surprisingly, is Canada. We use more on a per capita basis of fossil fuels, China passed this last year, and the developing world passed the developed world, but we still are leaders in the emission of greenhouse gases. And in our per capita consumption, there was an interest in our per capita production of trash. In how much trash is in the world ocean, the estimate has been made that the US, with a population of 5% of the world population, generates 50% of the trash in the world ocean. Somehow that doesn't quite compete. All right, so we are very clearly a leader. Now, tonight our subject is nuclear power, potential advantages and challenges. And our speaker is Joe Wambold, and I'm going to introduce Joe in just a couple of minutes. But let me give you some statistics to set the context. In the US, 71% of all electrical energy use comes from fossil fuels, 71%. About 6.5% comes from hydroelectric power, 20% or a little less from nuclear, and the remainder is wind, solar, and geothermal. So 71% fossil, 6.5% hydroelectric, 20% nuclear. You can see that solar and wind and geothermal don't account for very much. Worldwide, about 2/3 of all electric energy used comes from fossil fuels, and most of that is from coal. China is building coal-fired plants at the rate of 2 or 3 every week or 2. They also are building nuclear plants, and they're going to have 50 come online in the next 50 years. In 2009, wind energy accounted for about 2% of total US total energy supply. It was up from 2008, but 2009, 2% of the total. In 2009, solar accounted for less than 0.1% of total US energy, and yes, it also is growing. Both of them are renewable, they're very green, they're very popular with the environmental community, and they very clearly belong in our portfolio of energy sources, and they must grow and account for a larger percentage. But the question is, can they meet the needs of society? Wind, solar, and other renewables. And even wind and solar come with challenges. The two biggest are the footprint and the contribution to baseload. Footprint is not carbon footprint, it's how much land you need to generate a certain amount of energy. If you have a 1 gigawatt, so a 1,000 megawatt nuclear plant, it takes something like 3/10 of a square mile. And Joe, if I've got this wrong, you can correct it. Less than a half a square mile. A 1 gigawatt solar farm would take about 50 square miles, and a 1 gigawatt wind farm would take about 200 square miles. So there are trade-offs. And if you give up land for solar panels or wind, are you sacrificing habitat and biodiversity? It's like growing plants to create for biofuels. In some cases, we know that by growing corn to produce ethanol, we increase the actual amount of CO2 to the atmosphere, and we take corn away from the food supply and use it to put fuel in our cars. Sugarcane is another one that is not a good feedstock for ethanol. Now, there are some others that aren't so bad. So, footprint, we have to be looking at the trade-offs of the renewables in terms of what they get us. Baseload is the amount of proven, consistent, around-the-clock, rain or shine power that utilities have to meet the needs of their customers. And baseload is the foundation of grid power. For wind, the wind's got to blow. For solar, the sun has to shine. Or you couldn't say, well, why don't we just, when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, store it up? We don't have very much capacity right now to store energy. But nuclear also comes with its own set of issues. Safety, both real and perceived, disposal of radioactive waste, the supply of uranium. There are some people who assert that we only have enough uranium to last another 50 years, and we're making these huge investments in nuclear plants, and we're going to run out of uranium. So, does nuclear belong in our portfolio? Joe's going to tell us all about that. He's going to answer all of these questions. Joe Wambold has had more than 35 years of experience in commercial nuclear power. He has been involved in the design, construction, and startup of new facilities, the operation, maintenance, plant decommissioning. He's been in training in business and regulatory management. From 1999 to 2005, he was vice president for nuclear generation for Southern California Edison, responsible for plant operations, maintenance, plant security, emergency preparedness, training, et cetera, and he had focused a lot on the San Onofre generating station. He retired from Southern California in 2005, but he still consults with Southern California Edison and with the nuclear industry. Got his bachelor's degree in engineering from Purdue, master's degree from Purdue, and before joining Southern California, he worked for the Bechtel Corporation. And I have a copy of both, maybe, Bruce, could you help me? If we can pass these around, those are what I spoke from, and I'm going to now give you the one, maybe James, you could help me. These are copies of Joe's slides, and there's one other thing that I will pass out, two other things. If you're interested in some of these issues, there are two books I would recommend. One is The Whole Earth Discipline. It is an excellent book. It's by Stuart Rand, the founder of the Whole Earth Catalog. He was in a panel that we had here on Valentine's Day.
Very good book.
It's a very good book, yes. And the other one is Powering the Future. It's a scientist's guide to energy independence. I was one of the reviewers of this book. I think it's worth reading. This, in case you want to know what those two are, on two sides of this. And now, without further ado, Joe, welcome.
Thank you, Jerry. Pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you this evening. And, the title, you can see, Increased Usage of Nuclear Power, but the question I'm going to try to provide some information for your consideration on is, why is there interest and support for using nuclear power to meet the United States energy needs and its environmental objectives? So I'm going to provide some background information on that so you can think for yourself whether the potential advantages that provides, how does that stack up against the challenges and the issues that creates of having increased usage of nuclear power to meet our energy, electrical energy, and our environmental objectives regarding creating electrical energy. Today's discussion will go over some background material to try and get us all kind of up to a level set on just some of the basics regarding creating energy, electrical energy with nuclear power. We'll then go through some performance issues. How are today's plants performing? We'll touch on a couple of issues there. Then we'll look at what's the current status of using nuclear power both in the world and particularly in the US. And then what are the challenges to getting increased usage? So that's kind of the outline of what I'd like to go through with you this evening. If time permits at the end, I've got a couple of comments to make on the nuclear power program in China that I was asked to at least offer some information on, so that'll be at the end. And then we'll have time for questions at the end too, I think. So I'll go through this material and then hopefully leave plenty of time to have some Q&A. Starting on background, let's go into uranium fuel first because it is the unique characteristic of the uranium ore that it contains a fissionable isotope, uranium-235, that leads to it being able to be used as a power source to create electrical energy. The process is that uranium is an ore. It's mined and milled, turned into uranium oxide. It then goes through a process called a conversion, which allows it to have the amount of this fissionable isotope, uranium-235, increased from about 1%, which is in the natural ore, up to about 3% to 5%. So 99% of the uranium ore is uranium-238, but it's this fissionable isotope that is enriched to a higher percentage that becomes the basis of creating the fuel for a nuclear power plant. That's turned into pellets. A fuel pellet is shown here. You get some idea of this, the scale of a pellet, size of a fingertip. It also shows it compared to a quarter there. And one of the major attributes of nuclear power is the density of the energy that exists in nuclear. As it shows there, it's equivalent, this one pellet, to 17,000 cubic feet of natural gas, 1,780 pounds of coal, or 149 gallons of oil. It's a very dense amount of energy, which has advantages for then using that as a fuel. Those fuel pellets are then turned into rods, hundreds of them stacked up into rods, and those rods are then grouped into a fuel assembly. This fuel assembly might be an array of about 12 by 12 rods, 14 feet tall. There's about 200 of these that go into a reactor. The reactors at San Onofre have about 217 fuel assemblies in each reactor. They would stay in the reactor for anywhere from 36 to 54 months, but every 2 years there's a refueling where some of the old assemblies are taken out, new assemblies are put in, and the fuel is shuffled around to get optimum use of the uranium fuel that is in these fuel assemblies.
How long does, just some shuffling goes on and some optimization, so how long does a single pellet, if you track one single pellet, so how long does the fuel last?
That was on your notes there. It's the one that says from 36 to 54 months. So any one fuel assembly, although there's changes made about every 2 years, any one assembly might be in there from up to 3 years to up to like 54 months, so that it would be utilized. Of course, it is the fissioning process that allows heat to be generated, and that allows steam to be created to power a turbine, which is typically how even a fossil fuel creates steam by combustion of its fuel. In this case, it's the fissioning process that creates the heat. And I'll show a diagram in a little bit that gives a little more information on just how that works. But it is this fissioning of this uranium-235 isotope that provides the energy and the heat to power the electrical power plant. That reaction that we just looked at is of course a controlled reaction, and there's there's control rods that are in the reactor that can be inserted or removed that allow you to control the startup and the rate and then the shutdown of the reactor in a controlled manner. This then touches on the used fuel. When it comes out of the reactor, it goes into first a pool that's shown on the left, and this is just a large pool that sits next to the reactor where the used fuel is allowed to cool for anywhere from 5 years to as much as 10 or 12 years. And after that period, it is in a state where it can be moved to what's called dry cask storage, which is shown on the right here. That's where it can be put into a more passive regime for cooling. It's put into canisters, which is the center part here, surrounded by a reinforced concrete shell. But once it's in there, there's no moving parts that keep it cool after that. It's a natural convection cooling, allows enough airflow to keep it in a cool state, and it's securely and safely stored in that manner for decades, up to 100 years, where it might have to be repackaged. So that's the way that fuel is being stored, pending the United States government coming and accepting the spent fuel for either recycling, which I'll talk about a little bit later, or disposal of the fuel, potentially at a place like Yucca Mountain, although as perhaps some of you have heard, Yucca Mountain has now been decided not to go forward by the current administration. But I'll talk a little bit more about that. Used fuel is a major issue in the potential for increased usage of nuclear power, and I'll touch on that in even more detail a little bit later. Uranium fuel as an ore, it's widely dispersed. It is relatively plentiful. Also, because of the locations it's in and the wide dispersity, it doesn't lend itself to a cartel being formed like we see with OPEC or oil. It is a commodity, so prices do for the ore increase in times of increased demand over the supply that's available in terms of the mines that are open or those processing techniques, mining, milling, enrichment, and so on. But there's other times when supply exceeds demand and the price will go back down. So it acts like an ore in terms of its pricing. But there's believed to be 100 years of easily available uranium ore. And then if you recycle the fuel, of course, then you're using used fuel to get even more energy out of the fuel. And again, I'll touch on that a little later. Okay, that's some background on uranium fuel, which is at the heart of using nuclear energy for electrical power. Let's go on to plant design at this point. As this diagram shows, the fuel assemblies we saw earlier are in the reactor vessel. Say maybe 200 of them are in there. And there's a cycle of water called the primary cycle that is going past that fuel, and that's where that fissioning process is giving up its heat to that cycle of water. Now in the type of reactor that's shown here, a pressurized water reactor, that cycle of water shown in red is at like 600 degrees, but it's under 2,000 psi of pressure, so it stays as a liquid in that cycle. But it gives up its heat to what's called a steam generator, and there could be anywhere from 2 to 4 of these inside of a nuclear power plant. The ones at San Onofre, there are 2 of those. And that's where it has a second cycle of water, as you can see, that is able to be turned into steam. That flows through the turbine spins and powers the generator, which provides electricity to the grid. Now the steam has to be condensed back to water to be refed to the steam generator, and that's this last cycle you see, which is either water from a body of water to cool the condenser, such as the ocean, or there could be cooling towers here, so that it's recycled through a cooling tower, rather than going back to the body of water from which it came. And I'll talk a little bit more about once-through cooling, which is what's used at the plants here in California at this time along the coast. Okay, let's go on to safety systems. This shows the containment itself, which is one of the key safety systems in a nuclear power plant. You'll note that the reactor vessel contains those fuel rods and fuel assemblies, and that 8 inches thick of steel. There's then another primary containment shield of about 36 inches of concrete, and then the actual containment vessel itself, which is a 1/4 inch steel plate and then 4 feet of reinforced concrete. This is there so that if there is any upset in the system, leakage, some type of accident, that the radioactive material would be contained inside the containment and not released to the environment. Now, in addition to the containment, there's other safety features such as multiple backup systems that allow for additional cooling water to be provided into the plant, and additional things such as independent trains of electrical power to make sure there's diverse means of making sure these safety systems work. But this shows the importance of the containment as a safety system that's used at nuclear power plants. Addressing the environment, in the area of air emissions, the nuclear power plants emit essentially no greenhouse gases, which is one of the attractive features about using today's plants and potentially looking at using more plants. In the area of water, marine cooling, there are ways, once-through cooling, there are ways to protect and mitigate the impact on the marine environment, and I'll show some details on that in a minute. The solid waste or used fuel that comes out of the reactor, it's not emitted to the environment like the byproducts of coal or gas or oil would be, but is fully contained and securely stored, but it is long-lived. The used fuel have to be taken care of for long periods of time. So that's one of the challenges and need to understand about used fuel. This graph shows that all sources of energy have some carbon footprint, CO2 or greenhouse gases, because on what's called a life cycle basis, just building the plant and continuing to do operation and maintenance on it, even if it's a hydro plant or a wind plant or a solar plant, leaves some carbon footprint. But as this shows, as we know, the large contributors to CO2 are both coal and natural gas, and nuclear is of an equivalency with the renewables in terms of a much smaller carbon footprint. And in fact, as this slide shows, of the emission-free power sources that are used in the United States at this time, nuclear makes up by far the largest amount, with hydro being 21% and renewables 7% of those energy sources that are being used to create electrical power that are emission-free, or essentially emission-free, with only the small life cycle footprint. Okay, here's an example. This happens to be San Onofre, the plant that's down in San Diego County. When once-through cooling is used, what can be done to try and protect the marine environment from harm that could come to fish and larvae and so on? And first thing that's done is to put in some protective features to protect the marine environment. And shown on this slide is both in the intake structure, there's special types of a velocity cap that can be put on to mitigate the entry of fish in the first place. The flow here is of a manner that the fish sense that there's a horizontal flow and they react to it by a sense of flight, which reduces the amount of fish that come into the intake in the first place. This shows here, but it's actually thousands of feet offshore and then brings the cooling water, as we saw in that cooling water cycle on the earlier diagram, into the plant. But there's also a feature that as the water comes into the plant, there's a way that the fish go into a forebay in which there's a fish return line that they're scooped into and returned to the ocean. So there's even a secondary way of salvaging the fish and returning them to the ocean. On the discharge side, once that water's gone through the condenser, it's about 20 degrees hotter than when it entered. So there needs to be a way of diffusing that heat back into the ocean rather than having it shock in one place, put back into the ocean. There's 8,000 feet of offshore pipe with diffusers along the way so that the effect of putting that thermal load back into the ocean is much muted and diffused.
What depth is the intake?
Well, this is about probably 3,000 feet offshore where this offshore intake is, and the depth there's maybe 100 feet or something. I'm not really sure, but it's offshore quite a ways.
When you say fish, what size fish are you talking about?
Well, all the sizes are in that marine environment. Now, the marine environment effects are fully mitigated. It was analyzed by the Coastal Commission, as it says on the top here. But in addition to the protective features, there's still some harm to fish that end up being entrained as that water comes in, and larvae. So what's done was called mitigation, so that the Marine Review Committee, which was under the auspices of the California Coastal Commission, was able to reach this conclusion. All the marine effects from this power plant have been fully mitigated. So the other things that were done, a kelp reef has been built off the coast near San Clemente, 171 acres. It creates a habitat for various types of fish in that kelp environment. I put the cost on here just to show that it's not a trivial undertaking, but it was a major investment to offset the impact of, notwithstanding those protective features, that there is still some harm to fish and larvae in the marine environment. The other feature was a enhancement of the San Dieguito Wetland Restoration Project, which created more than 150 acres of wetland in San Diego County. That provides habitat for both fish and birds and so on for that environment. And the cost there was $90 million. And these are both in operation now. So they were put into place to mitigate the remaining effect on the marine environment from operating this plant's cooling system. And again, it was the California Coastal Commission, not the plant operator, that said, now you've reached a state where you've mitigated for the harm that you might have had by operating your power plant. Okay, let's go on to land use. Jerry touched on this a little bit. My figures, I think, are similar, although not exact. I think his are even a little more dramatic, but the land use requirements for 1,000 megawatts, or a gigawatt, as Jerry said, for nuclear, that would take about 1,000 acres. But for nuclear, you get a plant that is, as Jerry touched on, called baseload, meaning it's meant to operate and does operate 24/7, 365 days a year. It's only taken down when these refuelings and some maintenance needs to be done, and they operate at about 90% of the time. For solar, it takes much more acreage for 1,000 megawatts, wind even more for 1,000 megawatts. But one of the issues to understand, both wind and solar are called intermittent resources because you don't always have the sun shining and you don't always have the wind blowing in a manner that can utilize those resources. So they get a capacity factor of about 30%, roughly speaking, compared to the 90%. But one of the other factors is, as you're using wind or solar to support the electrical grid, you've got that type of supply supporting the current demand in real time for electricity. And if the wind dies down or the sun gets clouds and those sources start to go down, something has to be available to the grid operator to put online right away to support the load. Otherwise, you'd have blackouts and brownouts occurring. And what that is gas-fired backup. That's what's used by the grid operator to support the load. So there's a coupling between using these intermittent renewable resources and the fact that you still need to use natural gas to support the grid stability. And as we've seen, natural gas has a huge carbon footprint. Public safety. Well, we again show the containment here, which we touched on earlier, but mention a few other things that these, not only the multiple barriers, but that there's redundant and diverse systems for making sure cooling comes to the containment. The NRC is an effective federal regulator. I know especially today's we sometimes wonder about how effective regulators are, the SEC or something in the financial community. But the NRC actually hires very capable people. They are devoted to training. A lot of their personnel come out of the nuclear Navy, so they're people that really do know their stuff. And they're an aggressive, I mean, they're fair, but they're very aggressive and actually a very competent regulator. The industry itself has additional oversight where they try to raise the performance up to even higher levels of excellence than is required for just compliance with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission standards. The personnel are highly trained. There's accredited training programs to work in a nuclear power plant as an electrician, engineers, operators. You must go through actually accredited training, fully meets the accredited principles for training. And the operators themselves are licensed by the federal government. It is also an environment, excuse me, of procedural compliance. The culture of a nuclear power plant is there's a right way to do things. Those things are written down, and they must be followed that way. Verbatim compliance with procedures. Now, the reason this is done most importantly, one would say, is that it's the right thing to do because it protects public health and safety. But there's also a solid business reason why these plants are operated, with safety being number one, and that is these plants are not allowed to operate if it doesn't have the full trust and confidence of the federal government and state authorities. If they think you're not capable of running the plant safety, plants have been shut down. They've been shut down for years until they're able to get their act together. So it's not just the right thing to do, but it's a necessary thing to do to run the business. So there's those two things that couple up that lead to the outstanding record that nuclear power has had. The bottom line being there's been no effect to the public health or safety due to the operation of nuclear power plants in this country. Plant security, of course, is also an issue. As we finish up our background section here, nuclear power plants are some of the most secure and safest industrial facilities in this nation. There's multiple access barriers to go into the plant and to move around the plant. There's an armed security force at the plants. There's perimeter and surveillance systems for the plant, intrusion detection systems. Coordination is done by the armed security force and the managers of the security force at the sites with state, local law enforcement and federal intelligence officials. And the NRC conducts inspections and testing to make sure that the plant would be ready to respond to such a thing as a terrorist attack. Also, the analyses, although the plants weren't designed with this capability, it has now been analyzed that they do have the capability to withstand a wide-body jet impact on key plant structures. There would be damage, but the public health and safety would be protected. Okay, with that background then, just to sort of maybe a level set, just to get some ideas in our mind about how nuclear power is used and what some of the key parameters are, let's look at how the current plants are performing. Well, the one I'll touch on just on this slide is capacity factor. The average for the industry in this country is 90%, so the plants are intended to be operated 24/7, 365 days a year, and that's what they're able to do. They shut down for planned outages outside of the high impact periods, such as here in California, we would not have an outage during the summer because that's when our electrical load is the highest. So we do the refuelings in the winter or in the spring. Let's look at production costs. This again now is for today's plants. So this doesn't include capital costs that were necessary to build the plants, but it's looking at today's plants and what production costs are for the fuel and then operation and maintenance costs to operate the plants. And although this goes up through 2006, the data for 2008 is slightly higher for each of these. Actually, gas is quite a bit higher for 2008. But what this shows is nuclear is both low cost and very stable in terms of its operation and fuel cost, where natural gas has had a period of some scarcities and volatility to its cost. And that's particularly seen as we look at the next slide on fuel, where uranium is low and stable. This is just for fuel now. For coal, it's higher but fairly low and stable, where gas, of course, bounces around, a lot of volatility and much higher. And why that can be particularly important is when we look, again, this puts them on an equal basis just for percentage purposes. We saw earlier coal and gas are both higher than nuclear in an absolute sense. But we're back to production costs now again, O&M and fuel. Fuel makes up a huge part of the coal and gas production cost, which means if there's volatility in that gas price, you immediately see a huge fluctuation in the cost to operate a gas plant. Where with nuclear, the percentage of fuel cost for the uranium and the processed uranium is inherently much smaller, plus you've already got 2 years of fuel in the reactor, so you've already got some protection against price spikes. This shows the breakdown of the different pieces I talked about earlier, but the point I really want to have a chance to make here is that the nuclear fuel cost is a much smaller percentage, which is one of the reasons why even volatility at all in the uranium ore has a very muted effect on the actual cost. Okay, let's move on to status and outlook. One thing to touch on here, we'll look at world electricity generation, what demand growth looks like for both the U.S. and the world. We'll look at U.S. and California generation. License renewal that's mentioned here for existing U.S. plants, U.S. nuclear plants, That's a process whereby the federal government, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, can take the existing plants were given licenses of 40 years. They're now, with the right analysis being done, being given a 20-year extension. And I'll show how that's proceeding with the 104 plants that exist in this country at this time, how they're proceeding to get additional usage for another 20 years, which is another way to get increased usage of nuclear power, is by extending the lives of the existing plants we had, in addition to considering whether we should build new ones. Okay, for the world, as we can see, still a very large chunk of coal being used, and as Jerry touched on, they're still developing coal as the resource to provide electricity for China in a big way. Oil is still a fairly big part, hydro around the world, nuclear at 16%, and then natural gas. Just a quick look at world statistics. There are 439 nuclear plants in 30 countries, 372 gigawatts, 16% as was shown on the earlier chart. 56 reactors are under construction around the world. 100 new plants are being planned, and then 200 are in a category called proposed.
Of those, how many are in the United States?
I'll show that, but there's 26 new units that are going through the licensing process, and there's one plant that's under construction, but it was a plant in the Tennessee Valley Authority's system that was never finished from the earlier era, and they decided to go ahead and finish that. That's the only one that's actually under construction right now. But there's 104 that are currently operating, and I'll show some pictures on that. Okay. Oh, and I should mention France, which may come to some of your mind. There are 59 of those 300-some plants are operating in France. But what we often hear about France is that's 80% of their electricity comes from nuclear. So we've seen here in the U.S. it's around 20%, or we will see. I think Jerry mentioned that. But in France, they get 80% of the electric power from nuclear.
It's from the previous slide that you have 200 projected proposed, 100 new plants planned, 56 under construction, and of the 439 you currently have, that's 16%. If you had all the other ones that you added up, what would that increase to 16% to?
Well, it would depend how much the demand was growing, how much the electricity was growing. So it's going to be a mitigated effect in terms of raising it a whole lot higher just because there's so much growth, especially in the developing world. In fact, that's what this chart touches on. We're going to see a 50% increase in demand for electricity around the world by 2025. In the industrial world, 1.6% per year, but the developing world, where we touched on earlier in the sustainability discussion that you all were having, where countries need to have that type of growth rate of use of electricity to raise their living standards. In the United States, the growth is down more like 1% a year, but even that can lead to a 21% increase by 2030. And these type of projections include fairly aggressive assumptions about continuing to get improvements in efficiency and conservation. So electricity is vital to a modern society, and it will continue to grow as populations grow and people try to raise their living standards. This shows the 104 units that are now operating in the United States. Just to notice in the West, there's relatively few as compared to the Midwest and the East, but there's one in Washington State, there's the 2 in San Diego County, 2 up in San Luis Obispo County, and there's 3 units just west of Phoenix, as far as what's in the West.
Are the ones up in Washington offline?
Pardon?
Are the ones up in Washington offline?
There's 1 unit in Washington that operates routinely at 90%. 1 unit. It's out near Hanford in eastern Washington. Kennewick, Pasco. U.S., about 20% nuclear, still a very heavy use of coal and natural gas. I think Jerry touched on how large the percentage is in the U.S. that uses fossil fuels for electricity generation. Renewables is growing, but still at only 3% for the U.S. Hydro, of course, can't grow much more. Most of the hydro capability has already been developed in this country. Very little oil is actually used for producing power in this country, not electric power. California, a little bit different. Large use of natural gas. Most of the new units that have been put online for California use natural gas. Still, coal is a pretty good slice, but that's from imported from other states, but used here in California. Nuclear at around 15%. Geothermal resources are used here in California, of course, and renewables is a larger chunk of what's used in California now than it is in the rest of the country, but still relatively small but growing. I mentioned licensed renewal earlier, the ability to take the current nuclear plants, the 104 that we've seen, and extend their lives from 40 years to 60 years. As you can see here, 59 have already gotten this approval from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. 19 the NRC has accepted for review, so they're under the process of being reviewed by the NRC. 20 plants have said that they intend to do that well before their licenses end, and 6 have not yet announced that they intend to do it, but most likely will. And this gives a better visual as to just what that means. The green part of this slide shows how the plants would come out of service if they didn't get this 20-year extension to their NRC license. And then the extension in the red shows the current fleet of plants, how long they'll be online with this 20-year extension. So rather than them starting to fall out of production here, starting in about 2010, that won't come till much later in the century before we start to not have the availability of the current plants. Yes?
After that 20 years, is there a possibility for another 20 years, or how's that?
They're actually looking at extending them to 80 years. Those analyses are underway. It largely has to do with making sure the impacts on some of the vessels and so on, that they understand what the aging process is doing to the reactor vessel or the steam generators from those large vessels we saw earlier. Okay, this shows where new plants are being pursued by filing license applications with the NRC. There's 26 new units that are shown on here at 17 different sites. I think there's a couple more sites on here that haven't yet made their filing with the NRC, but there's 17 that have, and 14 of those sites are where there's already existing nuclear plants, so that shouldn't be surprising. A place that's already committed land and resources to nuclear often ends up being a good place to look for an extension of that capability.
Well, that goes with the grid and the infrastructure and everything else.
Yeah. If you may have heard recently, it's this plant that's in Georgia called Wambold that was recently announced by the Obama administration as being the first to obtain a loan guarantee from the government. Not just nuclear plants, but other emission-free plants are able to get a loan backing from the United States government as an incentive to develop non-GHG types of generation. Okay, the next slide will actually now focus on what are the drivers, as it's called here, or issues that lead to the interest and the support, including from the current administration in Washington, to be wanting to encourage development of new nuclear power plants. Well, we've seen earlier that the demand is still growing, so we still need power, and we need baseload power. We need baseload that operates 24/7, 365 days a year to complement the use of increasing amounts of renewables, wind and solar. This isn't lieu thereof, this is in complement of. Security of supply, which particularly means that uranium isn't subject to some of the problems that there are with like an OPEC type of cartel. Plus you can actually have the uranium processed into fuel and in the reactor, and it's there for 2 years, so you don't get immediate problems with any disruption in the supply chain. Another aspect of security of supply that's worth mentioning is the concept that by using nuclear power plants at night to recharge electric vehicles in an electric transportation scheme where you would have a larger amount of electrification of the transportation, both trucks and passenger cars, that actually then reduces the amount of imported oil, which of course would really be an important thing of security of supply when you can see nuclear power offsetting the need to import oil. Climate change, we've talked about greenhouse gases and that attractive feature that nuclear power doesn't essentially have any greenhouse gases. Energy Policy Act of 2005 is where the federal government set up incentives such as this loan guarantee program for types of power that don't emit greenhouse gases. The NRC combined construction operating license, the point to make there is you may recall that in the first fleet of nuclear plants, there was a lot of delays as those were coming into service, and that also ran up the cost very high. What had happened, this is just one thing that happened in that era, but one thing that did happen was the NRC at that point had a licensing process where first you got a license to construct a plant, and then you had to get a separate license, an additional license to operate the plant. Well, what happened was there was long delays after all the money had been invested to build the plant in going over issues again, or new issues that had arisen. to allow the plant to come in service. What the NRC does now is there's one license up front that's granted, and then you have to show that you built what you were licensed to build. You have to have the records and the inspections and the tests that show that you built what you said you would build. But if you've done that, then you'll be able to bring it online when you're finished. They're also going to standardize designs. The 104 plants that exist now probably have 50, 60 somewhat different type of designs as things were evolving in the earlier developmental period of the 70s and 80s, if you want to think of it that way. That chart I showed a little bit back, there's probably only going to be 3 or 4. I should have mentioned that color code that's on that slide was to show the different types of nuclear systems that would be used. And rather than having this multiple variations, there's probably going to end up only being 3 that will be used in this country.
What are the types of systems being looked at?
One is, it's got to do with the provider. One will be by a Westinghouse type of design, which is an evolution of the ones Westinghouse has provided before. One is from Areva, which is a French company. They originally got the US technology, but now they've developed it because they've still been building plants in France and other places. And now they're selling that back to the US as one option. The other is a General Electric design, which is also already used in an earlier generation of plant here in the US.
They're all double water loop.
Yeah, and they're all what's called light water reactors. They're not, there's other types of plants called Generation 4 is what it's called, but these are more high temperature, gas cooled, graphite moderated. If you hear terms like that, they're an advanced type of reactor that hasn't yet been deployed commercially. These are just evolutions of earlier designs. But the point would be here that they'll be standardized. In other words, the one that may be built in Maryland will be the same as the one that's built in Texas. And they, I think us engineers say this to ourselves just to make sure we know we really mean it, is right down to the wallpaper and the location of the light socket. I mean, they mean standardization. We've got to really standardize. Conducive state regulations has to do with some states, perhaps most notably Georgia, where we saw it's one of the first plants that'll probably be built, and then also South Carolina. The states have decided that nuclear power needs to be a part of their portfolio in an enhanced, increased amount, and to meet their environmental objectives and their need for power. And they've then provided in their state laws ways that the utility company will get back its investment as it's building the plant and not waiting until the plant's built to start recovering its investment. Now that was necessary to get people to move forward and decide to make the investment move forward with these plants. So some states have made a decision that they want to do that to have a conducive environment.
Where would you rank California in that last category?
Well, most notably, as we know, California currently has a statute that prohibits licensing of new nuclear plants at this time. But there is increased interest, most particularly because of the greenhouse gas issue, as to wondering whether nuclear will need to be an important part of meeting California's energy needs, increased usage. Okay, let's go on to challenges, which is certainly appropriate to note. What would be the issues or challenges to pursuing increased uses of nuclear power in this country? As we saw, many places are going forward with the licensing, but there certainly are challenges. I'll go over an overview, but two I'll go into some depth. Are high capital costs. The cost to build these plants is large. There's a major front-end investment, which is a challenge to figure out how to do and how to get the financing set up. And then we'll go over some additional facts about used fuel, which is a concern that many have, and there's also some misunderstanding on that, I believe. High capital costs, again, I'll go over that a little bit more, but we're talking about $10 to $15 billion worth of investment to build a new 2-unit nuclear plant. So this is a major financial undertaking and is not modularized typically. There is some talk about coming out with smaller nuclear plants that can be built kind of in a series at a much smaller capacity in each one. But the ones we're talking about today are all these large 1,000 megawatt ones, and they have a very large price tag to get them built and started up. And again, I'll talk about the used fuel issue a little bit more. But there's some other features here that are current challenges for reviving the nuclear use of nuclear power in the United States. Qualified components. The manufacturers and suppliers that provided valves and piping and electrical components that meet nuclear grade qualifications in the United States has atrophied. We haven't been building any. And we didn't try and compete well in overseas markets. So that has to be rebuilt, or we have to create supply chains that get that material from overseas. There'll probably be some mixture of that, but in the US, We do not have the manufacturing infrastructure that had existed before. Somewhat similarly for skilled personnel, whether it's engineers or welders or electricians, would need to redevelop those skills and capabilities in the workforce to be able to have any large uptick in the amount of nuclear power plants that would be built. These plants take something like 15 years to get licensed, designed, acquire the material, and build them. And with these huge price tags, that's a real challenge. It's tough to have something that takes that long in terms of how do you figure out, deploying resources, how much it's going to cost, what should be the schedule, when it's something that you start today and don't actually get the product out of it for 15 years. Cost and schedule performance therefore can be an issue. We know in the past there's been plans to build plants at a certain cost and schedule, but the results were much different. We've got to have a different future this time. The markets won't stand for something that's going to end up costing 2 or 3 times what they thought it was going to cost and have a 2-year delay. We can't have that type of a world going forward. There also is anti-nuclear resistance or concerns or understanding. The latest polls show something like 70% of the people in the U.S. support the use of nuclear power. It's something like 90% around the location of actual plants, but the 70% still leaves 30%, of which some of that 30% is very concerned and is very vocal about their concerns. So there certainly is that aspect that there's not a consensus by any means of this being the right thing to do to have an increased usage of nuclear power.
Did you say the consensus to use it was 90% in the neighborhood of the plant?
Right.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, the 30% are coal lobbyists. That's
Or coal states.
Yeah, coal states.
High capital cost, again, this now goes for $5,000 a kilowatt, $5 billion a unit. The earlier slide said for a 2-unit plant, you're looking at $10 billion. The market capitalization for even some of the largest utilities is maybe $40 billion. So that's a huge undertaking just financially to put together the type of financing package, equity and debt and so on, to be able to support the building of one of these plants. And in the area of risk sharing, as many of you would know, when you try to put together all the players that have to be part of building a plant, from the utility to designers, constructors, suppliers, the concept is whatever entity is best able to manage a risk, that's the one that should accept that risk. But when you try to turn that into a series of contracts with people obviously trying to protect themselves from taking risk, except where they need to sell their product, it's a real challenge to get these contracts set up. Earlier, there was a lot of the consequences of building the first plants that fell back on customers under regulated utility type of approach. But in the end, a lot of the utility commissions say, well, we're not going to put all this burden on the utility customers, and shareholders had to take a slice of that. That has to be done better this time or it won't work in terms of who's accepting the risk and how they manage the risk.
For price per kilowatt, do you have comparisons to, coal or natural gas and wind or solar?
Okay, the reason I don't show that, as far as new plant versus new plant, is because the capital costs vary so much all over the map. You can have a nuclear advocate come in here and he'll say, we're going to do it real cheap. I don't buy that myself. I think it's a costly proposition. But you also have complications in the use of renewables, especially when you understand they have to be coupled with gas to meet the needs of the power grid. So it's a complexity that I chose not to try and use here. It's an obvious question. It's the right question to ask, but it's a difficult thing to try and get your hands around.
Well, yeah, but, I'm agreeing with you that wind, bet on it being around 30% of the time if you sited it reasonably. So even if it has a $2,000 per kilowatt apparent price, it's really at least $6,000 because you're only using it 30% of the time.
Right.
And that power has to come from
Some of the graphs you'll see will show that a nuclear power plant, when you take all the kilowatt hours that will eventually come out of it over its life, and then you assume its life's going to be 40, 60, maybe even 80 years, and then you look at a similar amount of kilowatt hours that you'll get out of a wind or a solar plant, and then show it on that basis, it'll tend to make nuclear look significantly more cost effective. But in my opinion, that's just one way of looking at the economics. It's a very complex issue.
So those figures you showed were for existing plants?
Yes.
Not new capital expense?
That's correct. And it's important for you to emphasize that, important for me to emphasize
Coal
it.
plants have a capital cost.
Right.
So.
But that was looking at how are today's plants doing? And they're the ones that exist today, because the capital costs have been recovered or written off, they're wonderful for customers because they really are low cost, as I've shown on some of the production and the O&M and fuel costs. But new plants brings in how much it costs to build the plant, and nuclear is a very high capital cost, even compared to coal. Even compared to coal, with the emerging technologies in coal you may have heard of, where there will be ways of capturing the carbon, the CO2, and sequestering it. Now these are unproven technologies, that's right, of capturing it and sequestering it in underground caverns and so on. And that's yet to be demonstrated, but that's of course where the coal lobbyists would want to, because they're not probably going to be allowed to have uncontrolled CO2 emissions in the future.
But
So
there's a trailing cost of coal called lives lost in mines and
yeah.
degradation of the environment,
That's right.
collapse of ecosystems.
Yeah.
So
well, in
that's
that
a
regard,
cost.
these are very complex issues. There are many that will say, what about when uranium was mined back in the 50s and 60s? And that was not done with any environmental sensitivity or protection of workers in terms of breathing in some of the aspects of mining uranium. Now, it didn't need to be that way, although I'm not trying to criticize the people that were doing that for the reasons they were doing it back in earlier decades. But we now know how to do it properly.
Well, coal mining deaths have gone down too, but there's still more coal mining deaths.
Yeah. Well, it's a more risky undertaking, just by its nature.
If, so far, the biggest challenge is the risk share that I've seen, that I hear in your voice.
Financing.
Well, those go together. And although the engineer may say, a gigawatt's just about the sweet spot, what about building ones that are a whole lot smaller, like you mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
that are easier to finance and easier to risk share?
Uh,
Even if you site them at the same place.
Well, that's an attractive alternative right now, and it's being actively looked at. One of the hurdles is those types have not yet been fully analyzed and are not licensable by the NRC. Okay, could they be? Well, yes, they could. But that process itself can take 5 years to go through the testing on a pilot scale basis and so on. I mean, to prove out these, with the care that's done to do that. There's also a loss of economies of scale. There is a benefit for building things big, except when to do the first one is so daunting that you can't ever even build the first one, then you never really get the economies of scale.
Isn't the French system a federal system?
Largely it is, and it really is in China too, which I'll touch on in a minute.
Yeah, so their technology's frozen, their training is the same all over, so there's an efficiency built in there. We tend to reinvent the wheel here, although you talked about there's standardizations coming to the
yeah, France is ahead of us in insisting on standardization, and the federal government's involvement there also leads to things like they have, as a country, made a commitment to nuclear, and therefore you don't have debates about how to finance it. The French government makes sure it's financeable.
Yeah, self-insured because it's a government program.
Joe, we'll let you finish your presentation now, and then we'll save the discussion for the end.
Used fuel. Let's look at some facts which maybe will address some misconceptions. There's relatively little used fuel that's actually produced, and one way to think about this, as we use analogies or metaphors, if you will, if a person was to have all the electricity they used over their life provided by nuclear power only, the amount of waste that would have created would be in a coffee cup. Yep. Now that goes back to the density of this material, its energy, and how much energy, electrical energy, it can produce. That's the amount of waste. Now, all the waste, as shown on here, that has been used in the U.S. to date, would go on a football field about 5 yards high. Now, in some ways that may seem like a lot, but when you compare it to the emissions from a coal plant or a gas plant, I mean, this is a solid material that's contained. We know where it is. It's not emitted into the environment. And when you think about the process of moving that to a geologic repository, or better yet, recycling it, because 90% of the fuel still has energy that can be used, and they are recycling fuel in France. They are doing it. They're not yet taking advantage of it at the 90% level, but they are taking advantage of some of the material that's in used fuel and breaking it down and reusing it. And of course, recycling, if you can do it safely, and you can do it without having proliferation risk, which means there's no part of the process where there's plutonium that can be mishandled, it is the right thing to do. We talked earlier about trying to make maximum use out of the materials that humans are dealing with in your sustainability discussion earlier. There's really not a debate about whether either the elements that come out of the reactor or the waste that results from recycling that, can that be put in a deep geologic repository? It's widely agreed that that can be done. Scientists agree with it. There's people that have other reasons not to support nuclear power, but they agree that, oh yeah, that can be done. What happened at Yucca Mountain is not a scientific issue, although it's challenging to make sure you do it right and it's going to stay there properly for long periods of time, that you're not going to have water intrusion. I mean, there certainly are challenges, and those are being dealt with by the Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. But what happened most recently was a classic NIMBY issue, if you will, not in my backyard. Nevada leadership, at least under Harry Reid, didn't want it there, and they felt that it had been inappropriately imposed on him during the Bush administration, and therefore they fought back, and he got a political concession. This is my view of what happened, but I think it's widely accepted, that he got a political concession from Obama, and when Obama got in office, he said, we're not going to proceed to use Yucca Mountain. So, and these things happen, but it wasn't because you can't properly dispose of used fuel.
Larry, let's let Joe finish, and then we'll discuss in the end.
Okay, let's see. One more slide on this. Used fuel transport systems have been demonstrated and tested. We know how to move used fuel around from a plant site to a recycling center or to disposal. I mentioned France is now doing recycling, and not yet up to the 90% level, but they are definitely engaged in reusing their fuel. This is not an unfunded liability. To be clear, as nuclear power is produced, 1 mil per kilowatt hour is paid to the federal government. They've now got $30 billion that have been provided to the federal government, including the interest they've gotten off of the money that's been given to them, to deal with the used fuel that the federal government has the obligation to eventually take and deal with. So it's not like we've left something for a future generation in a cost supportive sense. We've actually collected for it and have it available in a fund to utilize to properly either recycle or deal with used fuel. And there actually is, although I often don't hear of the fact that there actually is a high-level radioactive waste disposal site in New Mexico. It doesn't do used fuel, but it does waste products that come from government sites that have been involved in nuclear operations for many years. Near Carlsbad. And it's a case, you touched on earlier, why did that not get involved in NIMBY? The local authorities and the state, and it was important that the state was a key party to this, both came to believe it could be done safely in salt caverns that exist in that part of New Mexico, and both saw the significant economic benefits to that locale, and therefore they accommodated and were receptive to it. Some of the problems with Yucca Mountain in Nevada, the locals in Nye County did want it because they saw great benefits for them, but the state was resistant to it, as I touched on earlier. But there's also Las Vegas is like 100 miles from Yucca Mountain, and just the economic swings of a few casinos can change any economic benefit you would get from this waste storage site. Where in New Mexico, that is a big issue in terms of providing support for schools and local infrastructure and so on. Okay, summary. Current plants, they operate safely. Continued operation is cost effective. That's why we see people going for license renewal, extending the operation for an additional 20 years on the basis of their production and O&M and fuel costs. These are baseload plants. They do operate at high capacity factors, 90% capacity factors. The environmental benefits are there in terms of no greenhouse gases. And used fuel, which is certainly an issue, it's a controversial issue, but it is fully contained, it's safely stored, and when we hear, at least some of us in the industry, that we don't know what to do with the fuel, well, we do know what to do with the fuel, but it's true that we haven't yet gone forward and done in this country, either in terms of disposal or recycling, although that's there to be done. Potential for new plants, we've talked about what would be some of the attractive attributes that would make people, including the current presidential administration, interested in expanding the use of nuclear power to meet the country's energy and environmental objectives. Well, it avoids greenhouse gases, baseload power, relative security and stability of fuel, but there are significant challenges, and the two I mentioned here are high capital cost, and again, this used fuel issue, which is a issue that is controversial. Now, just quickly, so I'll wrap this up and we'll have time for questions. Comments on nuclear power in China. This map, this is busy, but there's 11 current plants operating in China, relatively small amount. but they've got 21 under construction. There's 56 that are in stages of planning to be deployed. Stats here. And it's another, let's see, it's part of its national policy. Nuclear is its preferred choice for energy and diversity of fuel and environmental reasons. In other words, as opposed to coal. Now, they're still building plenty of coal plants, but they want to start building as many nuclear plants as they can possibly support with materials and people. They use a technology acquisition approach. What that means is they buy things from the U.S. And actually, I have a colleague that's there this week because they've sold $500 million worth of instrumentation and controls to one of the plants. But they sell that one time, and the contract acquirer allows China to then internalize that technology and build it themselves the next time. So they want to become self-sufficient. And if you don't want to sell that to them on that basis, somebody else will. So they actually have the leverage to get those type of agreements in the contracts. So it's a one-time shot, basically, unless you can keep advancing your technology faster than they can reuse it. I think, I don't mean to be overly pejorative, but they sometimes say in China R&D means replicate and duplicate or something like that.
Can we buy that back then for our?
Well, we may. That's what they say. If we don't, if we decide there's another future without expansion of nuclear power for this country, then that may be, and what would be the strategy, and how would you put it together, and what would be the ramifications. But if you're going to do nuclear power, we should probably get moving now, or we'll be captive to the rest of the world, having gone far ahead in terms of creating the supply chains and the technology and so on. Finally, financially, it's all backed by the government. We touched on that earlier, I think, with France, but in China, he said you don't need a loan guarantee. If they allow you to build it and tell you to build it, then you've got the financing to build it. That's the way the China system works. I don't claim to be an expert on China's culture and politics and regulatory and legal issues, but I'm using this as an example. The colleague I mentioned actually does work at this site. This is an artist rendering of a place where there will be 6 new units. 2 are now under construction. But this was a fishing village, and when the Chinese government decided this was going to be an ideal spot for a nuclear plant, they simply told the people, you're moving, we're going to relocate you. There wasn't a lawsuit, there wasn't regulatory issues, it wasn't hung up in 2 or 3 years of regulatory processing. The federal government said, this is part of our master plan, we're going to put 6 units here. Now, that is a reason why China can move forward with national policies. I'm certainly not suggesting we'd want to do things that way here. That isn't the way we do things here, at least as far as I understand it, or would want it. But China has a different culture and a different way that they get things done. But they can go forward and get things done.
Three Gorges Dam. They just moved the people, gave better homes, gave upgraded homes, and then flooded the valley.
Yeah, but people, if they treat them reasonably fair with a new, that's good. But the people don't get to say, I don't want to leave. There's no such, or I'm going to go get my lawyer and file a suit against the government. It's like, it just doesn't
People,
happen.
when we were over there, they were all happy because they'd been upgraded. They had indoor plumbing now.
First of all, I want to thank Joe for a
Yes,
wonderful.
thank you.
And we do have some time for discussion. And also, I harassed him when he came in, but Bob Grove over there, I'm talking about it. Bob Grove works for Southern California ES, and he's been very involved in the Wheeler North Giant Kelp mitigation project. And so if anybody has any questions about that, we can direct them at Bob. So
Thank
we
you,
have
Bob.
2 experts here, in the back and then up here.
Maybe a twofold question. But the first is reactionary to the Chinese, developing all these things. Well, what is your personal opinion of their ability to be safe in terms of their manufacturing? When you look at earthquakes and the substandard schools they built and everything else, I mean, is China going to follow the plans, or are they going to shortcut it or something? I mean,
Well, it's a good question. I think we've all heard some of the experiences with different products. There is an organization called World Association of Nuclear Operators, and that has existed since Chernobyl occurred back in 1986. And its mission is to go to other countries and do firsthand inspections in an attempt to be able to identify whether there's major pitfalls or issues that are occurring. Now, that's not the same as having a high quality control and quality assurance system, but at least there's an effort made worldwide, because worldwide the nuclear industry does understand that a failure at another plant somewhere in the world, it affects all plants essentially immediately. So there is a risk that you could even take it as far as investments made here could be at risk if things aren't really being run well in China. So I think it's a good issue to bring up, and I don't think there's a simple answer. I wouldn't be the one to just dismiss it as not relevant. I think it is an issue.
The second part of that, you mentioned Chernobyl. You know, the number one anti-nuclear consensus, I guess, of the no nukes people is either Chernobyl or Three Rivers, or rather than Three Mile. Now, what have we learned from those two disasters in terms of new development? I mean, are we never going to repeat those?
Okay, comments on that. Chernobyl had no containment. Okay, I point out a couple of times how important the containment was. It was a risky way to deploy nuclear power. It came home to roost for the Russian government and the Russian nuclear industry. They weaned themselves off of those type of plants. I don't think there's any operating anymore of that type. And the ones they're building today, and Russia is building new plants, all have a containment. Now, there was a containment at 3 Mile Island, and in fact, it worked. That's why it was there, and it did what it was supposed to do. Although there was tremendous damage, and it was certainly a big financial loss. Now, what the industry did, that happened in 1979, two key lessons learned were to simplify the safety systems. Just things like in the control room, they called what's human factor engineered, so it was more obvious to operators by ways of having different indicators as to what was flowing where, what temperatures were, so they could operate it better. And also there was a major upgrade in training at that point. And that led to this thing called the Training Academy, which is this accreditation process that actually uses standardized accreditation processes in the US for how you do accredited training for either professionals or for craftsmen.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm pro nuclear power, but I have a question about the Santa Susana accident in 1959. Do you know anything about that?
No, I don't. No, it goes back a long ways, and you know what happened then predates my involvement, so, and I haven't studied it. So.
And I don't know about that one, but with 3 Mile Island, I did a lot of work earlier in the Chesapeake Bay and Susquehanna River. That functioned just the way it was designed to. It was a bad accident, but there was no damage or danger to human health. There was no risk to the environment.
Right.
Nothing was released. The redundancy behaved exactly the way it was supposed to.
You know, there's all this concern about this atomic energy, you know, the safety. As far as I could find out, just Googling the issue, 3,000 coal miners die a year, and 0 die in nuclear actions, including the United States Navy, and they live next to reactors. That whole safety issue is revolving around atomic bombs in World War II. It has nothing to do with atomic energy today.
Well, a comment on that, when you're in the industry, a way to think of that is we can, of course, become complacent about the need to have high safety standards to make sure that sustains itself. And one way to do that is that there's multiple layers of defense in depth and procedures and things that I've mentioned. And if there's any erosion in that, that we have to take that as that's unacceptable. It's not like, well, don't worry, if that's not working, the other train will be working. You can't think of it that way. So it doesn't come by just inherently. There has to be a day-by-day, shift-by-shift commitment to having standards be very high, so that with human beings involved, there's always going to be some erosion of them. There's always going to be mistakes. I mean, you got to understand that. But that you've got so much redundancy and so much barriers that as long as you react to build those barriers right back up, then you're able to get the type of results you mentioned.
That's a good thing, but everything that people think about atomic energy revolves around atomic bombs. It's got nothing to do with the 0 deaths that occur in the atomic industry worldwide.
Yeah, that legacy is there. Yeah.
It's amazing.
Okay, first off, I was taking reactor operation as a certification elective when I was at the University of Maryland when 3 Mile Island went down. And we were the closest research facility to TMI. I damn near flunked out of the University of Maryland because I slept in the halls of the physics department making those stupid calculations about hydrogen bubbles. Okay, you could not have screwed that power plant up any worse, any way you tried, and it still put out a little bit of iodine gas as a vent. And the thing I liked best was the reporter flying from San Francisco to cover it to Pennsylvania would have gotten more radiation on the flight than if he sat on top of that building. But, and that was a training issue primarily, more than anything else, and so was Chernobyl. They were screwing around doing a test that they should not have done.
That's correct.
So those are two training issues more than anything else, and that has been addressed since then. But anyway, the thing that I worry, really the only thing I worry about in nuclear power is the genie out of the bottle, the strategic risks. And especially if you're going to use it long term, you start running into plutonium. How do you get away from that?
Well, first, if you just focus on the United States, you know, that's one thing, but other countries are pursuing the use of nuclear power, so I think all I can do is try and have agreements with them on how the used fuel or recycling process is managed so that there's not the risk of plutonium proliferation. Now, one of the research efforts that's going on is to develop a method that's both economic and practical to utilize, where as you recycle the fuel, you never have a step where the plutonium is freed up from the other constituents of the fuel. That way no one can come and get it as a weapons grade material and take it away, because it's encased in something that makes it too difficult to actually obtain and steal or divert. So there are some research type of approaches to making it more proliferation resistant. Now, the federal government did have a concept called Global Nuclear Energy Program, GNEP, and what the idea there was to say to other countries, developing countries, we support you developing nuclear power to raise your standards of living, but we don't want you being the developer of the fuel or the recycler or dispositioner of the used fuel. We, the United States government, will provide you the fuel under contract, and then after you've used it, we'll take it back. And that was an attempt to say, you know, we know better than you how to deal with used fuel. But you can set up the economics of that to make sense to a country, but a lot of them, I think, see it as, you know, you're trying to be patronizing to them too much. You know, it seems to get into their own nation space or something.
We got one over here. Yes, go ahead.
I had a question. Well, when we still have the problem of spent fuel and what to do with it, but how much associated equipment becomes irradiated during the life of a reactor that has to be disposed of as well?
Good question. At San Onofre, there was an original Unit 1 there, about half the size of the current units. It was a demonstration reactor that operated for 25 years. We shut it down in 1992, operated reasonably well, but it was a demonstration type of reactor. And at that point, it reached its end of economic life. It's all been torn down now. The materials that were salvageable and not radioactive were recycled or disposed of. The material that was radioactive went to licensed disposal facilities. There's one that we used that was in South Carolina, at Barnwell, South Carolina. The other is up in Clive, Utah, outside of Salt Lake City. The things that remain at the site from that unit are used fuel, which the federal government hasn't yet come to take, and the reactor vessel itself, which is encapsulated and stored and ready to ship to a site. But all the other material has been shipped out and disposed of, much of it radioactive. So there's ways to dispose of it and bury it safely. And here I'm talking about low-level radioactive waste, not high-level radioactive waste, which is the fuel.
Years ago, I was involved in the deep seabed burial of waste in nuclear power plants. And the idea, remember your plate tectonics, ocean floor rises under the mid-oceanic grid system, the sea floor spreads apart and goes down in the trenches. And the recommendations that we made was if you don't have no land-based methods, you put it in the trenches. It will go back into the earth, and it's 200 million years before it may emerge on the other side.
Well, this facility,
Just fold it in.
Jerry, the facility in New Mexico is where these salt caverns eventually they collapse on and encapsulate everything, and you can't get back at it.
But you wouldn't have believed the outcry from some of our colleagues, oceanographers, that we were advocating destroying the ocean. And this was a really good group of people. I was involved, people from Woods Hole, Oceanographic Institution. But wait, before we come back to you, because he doesn't have a book to sell. And so we make him buy a book for every second. But Bob.
Yeah, I'm curious of some of the volumes of used fuel versus the military's high level waste. You have the volume
5-yard high football field for used fuel power plants. Now, how much military waste is out there? I mean, where is it? And then also hospital waste, is that all low?
Hospital waste is typically low-level waste, right?
Okay, so can they put that, what do they do, put that in barrels?
Yeah, that's also shipped to places like this facility in Utah that I mentioned.
Okay,
Yeah.
but that's all low, so
There
what
was-
about high?
Just to touch on low-level waste for a minute, there is a standing law in the United States that states and groups of states were supposed to develop their own low-level waste facilities. And the one in California was going to be at a place called Ward Valley out in the eastern desert. But there was resistance to using that for that purpose, and therefore Arizona and California have not developed their own low-level waste disposal site. So they're allowed to ship it to some other places that will dispose of it. One of the reasons we haven't disposed of the reactor vessel I mentioned is the place where it would go would be Barnwell, South Carolina, and we eventually said, why do we want to try and ship that to, I mean, when it can just sit here at the site for an indefinite period. I'm not an expert on the military waste. Some of that was going to go into Yucca Mountain, but it was only about 10%. So this is why you'll hear people in Washington State are also very upset that the Obama administration isn't moving forward on Yucca Mountain, as are people in South Carolina because of the Savannah River site, which is a federal site for military activities related to nuclear materials. Because they said, hey, we've had this waste here for years. A place was chosen to be where it would be deposited, and now you've canceled that. So those states are saying, what you did isn't right. There's a law that said it was supposed to go there, and you shouldn't just be canceling it.
So no real feel for how much high-level rate waste the military has to produce?
No, but some of it there is what they're bearing at this Carlsbad facility, but I can't cite any figures even comparable like the 5 yards of a football field. Sorry.
Yeah, another thing on spent fuel, I remember down Joe Reeves, Kent Slagle, and Unit 1, and trucks would come in and take away high-level spent fuel, I thought. Where did they take it? And was there processing somewhere?
Well, that goes back a long way. No fuel has left that site for, I don't know, 25 years maybe, but before that, it was sent back to a General Electric facility in near Chicago and was stored there, and that's because that was a place that was going to do recycling of the fuel. Then when the federal government decided to not go forward with recycling at this time, we still have several fuel assemblies from this original Unit 1, none from Units 2 and 3, the new units, but from Unit 1 that are sitting at a place in Illinois, outside of Chicago.
Okay, so there's never been processing in the U.S.?
There has been. There was some processing done at a place called West Valley in New York, some pilot type of programs. But then those, before they went to a commercial level and really started doing recycling, this is back 70s, it was stopped most notably during the Carter administration. I think he was the one that said we're not going to pursue recycling in this country. And that has stood the test of time up till now. Meanwhile, France, of course, has gone forward with it.
One last deepest question about recycling. Because I went to Japan, went to the nuclear plants, ships come in and take away the spent fuel assemblies. Where do they go?
France.
Okay, so France.
Yeah, and Japan has recently built their own Ricochet, I think is the name of it, in a similar technology as what's used in France.
Thanks.
And there is some recycling that's been done in
I've had these questions for 25 years.
We're going to charge you double or for this. Anybody else have a question before? Larry will never exhaust his question. But I want us to be thinking though in a little bit of time. How do you put these in perspective relative to other risks? We're going to have energy. And the question is, how do you change perceptions? Lots of people die mining coal. You have greenhouse gas emissions from all of the fossil fuels. We've heard the safety record here, no greenhouse gas emissions. We can't get to where we want to be in terms of renewables, at least for decades, many decades. So is nuclear at least a good part of the should it be part of the portfolio at least until we get to a renewable future? That's the real question. Larry, you have the answer?
Yeah.
That was it.
Of course.
That's a short
Instead of putting them
answer.
in ships, put them in the municipalities. Nice small reactor?
Well, nice small reactors.
Yeah, nice, well, nice. I was like, what's a ship reactor, probably
It's really
two
small.
hundred megawatts?
Oh, no, no, smaller, way smaller than that, very small.
Well, no,
Yeah.
got 200.
Yeah, very small.
Power, what,
Yeah.
100,000 horsepower.
Yeah, it's less, probably less than a megawatt, it's small.
Yeah, 100 megawatts, but they run forever, you know?
Yeah, they've done well.
So, we're both.
No, but I was gonna say, talk about your dropping in the ocean and watch it fold under. At the University of Maryland, we had a research reactor, and you could watch the reaction go. It's a blue color, it's really pretty. You're 22 feet away from it. That's from here to that wall, maybe a little bit further.
Is that what
And there's nothing but water between you and that. And it's a full-fledged reaction going on. Yeah, it's a full-fledged critical reaction. And the film badges don't show anything. You got, you know. And the crazy thing is that you could dispose of this in the water. The amount of time a fish would have to spend around there would be, I don't know why we don't throw it in the water. Glassify it first so it doesn't dissolve and take the chemical action out of it.
You mentioned
But
Stuart Brandt's book.
Yeah.
What it is the re-education of a early environmentalist, the Whole Earth Catalog guy. And, you know, he was for country living, now he's for urban living. He was against genetically modified foods, now he's for Franken food. Because, you know, otherwise we'd starve to death. And his thinking, and he goes through and tells you about his old thinking and then his re-education. And his thing on atomic energy is really interesting. He goes through and tells you how he had the knee-jerk reaction to atomic power, and then now that he's re-educated or he's been relearned. But the process he goes through is interesting, and that's the process most of us go through when we reteach our things. And that's why I found this book so interesting, because it was in layman's terms, and so.
It's a very good book.
Yeah.
Another environmentalist that's very outspoken supporter of nuclear power now is Patrick Moore, who was one of the co-founders of Greenpeace.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
later
in fact,
on,
he mentions him in the book that some people are still against it, but they've never, they've never accepted new technology.
If you're going to be, you have to be for something. You can't just be against it.
Yeah,
That's the problem.
that's it. It's easy to be against
So
something.
you're talking about the Republicans now?
Hell no.
Before, anybody over here have a question? Or not you, Bob.
I see the other drawback is the startup time. Like the one in Georgia that's starting,
Yeah.
or maybe starting, how long from now until it starts operating is your best guess?
Well, the one that's first in line to get this loan guarantee has gone through a large part of the NRC licensing process, and they've also made some financial commitments for some of the largest vessels that take a long lead time to get prepared. Their most optimistic dates for being online would be maybe 2017 or 2018, but they've been at the planning and licensing stages for maybe 5 years now, so that's why I use a rough number of 15 years to.
So the question is, catching up to China and France, I mean, it's going to be so hard to catch up, I think.
Well, there's that, and also one of the things you all may want to think about is as an antidote for greenhouse gases, something that takes 10, 12, 15 years to be operable. I mean, now greenhouse gases take time too, so I mean, it's if by 2050 you can have a lot more power available that has no greenhouse gases, that's a good thing to have done, but it doesn't happen in just a year or two.
Suzanne, I'm going to ask you, but not that guy.
I know, I have
Okay.
to.
Control your husband.
Good luck.
All right, Zan.
Super quick, I didn't see any of the notes. If it's taking us 15 years, can you give me the stats for China and France and how long it's taking them to cycle from start to power on?
Well, it'll be lower because they, as I said, they
Right.
have a federal dictate mode of doing things, and they're quite committed in terms of the process they use to actually build the plants. So it would be under 10 years for them.
So it's still long, it's not.
It's still long, yeah, it's still long. I mean, some of the quotes you'll sometimes hear is that a plant can be built in 4 or 5 years, and that's from actually starting the construction till going into startup and online. But before that, you've had to design it, you've had to get the right approvals, you've had to have the licensing, at least that takes years in this country. In China, it might be different in terms of the time that it takes to do that. but there's also a long lead time to obtain some of the material, most notably the large forgings that are used for the reactor vessel and the steam generators. For the largest of plants that's used today, there's basically one place in the world that can produce those, and it's Japan Steel Works in Japan. But China is now building their own facility to be able to do that in accordance with what they've said, that they want to be self-sufficient.
So John, what are you gonna tell your little kids, your fourth, fifth graders now?
Good question, I don't know. I have to take a look at it, for sure.
Well, I think that's probably the point. We really need to be talking about these issues. Too many issues really are off limits. We're not, we shouldn't be talking about them. And it's interesting, when we just recently had our reaccreditation by the American Zoo and Aquarium Association, and in the report they said that it's the only aquarium they know of in the country that is willing to take on these big, controversial, complex issues. And one of them was from another aquarium in the state, a very outstanding aquarium. He said we could never do it in our aquarium. And the other comment I loved was that this aquarium not only acknowledges the elephant in the room, but it dances with it.
Well, that's thanks to you, Jerry.
No. Does anybody have one last one? If you haven't had anything you're going away wishing you had asked or wishing you had said, because again, we're trying to share views. In 4 weeks, I hope we will all have a better understanding of some of the ways to get to this kind of sustainable future that we talked about. And yes, you've been fairly quiet. You go ahead.
The only thing I see is from what he was saying, that if there's some possible way that you could get the knowledge that he proceeded to give us spread out to the general public so that they understood all the issues at hand, because of the difficulty of saying, well, this is dangerous, that's dangerous, the things you talked about, people don't know about, so they immediately are negative to it. It needs better education.
Right, and you gave a wonderful overview, I think. So we did videotape it, and so we will use that. I think I agree. We have to somehow.
That's a good point.
Let's our show.
Two more, and then we're going to end. Now,
It's pretty clear that nuclear power is the way to go. Why is it that a country such as France is able to get the national blessing to go ahead and have these types of power plants, but the United States, the technology it does have, seems to be in a lockdown, and we can't do anything, go anywhere? What can we do to correct that?
Take that back to Washington and rise of influence.
There's a line of logic that is used to apply to France, but it applies other places too, is that back many decades ago now, when France was making a large commitment that they were going to develop nuclear power for their electric system, and it was a saying of no coal, no oil, no choice. And France, given what France is, their national pride and wanting to be their own safe, secure country, when they recognized they didn't want to be dependent on oil any more than they are for, say, the transportation sector, they didn't have any coal resources like Germany has or we have in this country, and they said we won't be able to have the electric system and the freedom to pursue our country's needs as we see fit unless we develop nuclear power. Japan is somewhat similar, where they don't have the natural resources. In other words, they don't have the choice of having used coal. In this country, we did have that choice, and we have used coal.
So if we wait long enough, we will use up all of those other resources and finally turn to the right thing.
but there's
Well,
a lot.
I think the greenhouse gas issue has put a major kink into that. Again, coal now, to be able to compete, is thinking that they're going to have to develop these means of capturing and sequestering carbon if they can do it effectively and economically. Because coal is a major energy resource that this country has, as is natural gas. But they do leave a large carbon footprint.
So if you look around the world, the U.S., huge coal reserves, China, Australia they export more coal than any other country on the planet. We're going to take one more. You get the last one. Better be good.
Well, this thing about we need several Earths to support the lifestyle, I do not agree with that. I
Okay.
think it's bogus.
Okay,
scientifically proven.
want to explain, tell us why?
Well, yeah, well, just, I can't prove it, but what makes you think that, that this is true?
Well, and I don't know whether that figure is true or not, and as somebody, you said it before, if you look at the rate at which we are using non-renewable resources, and we know something about what the reserves are. King Hubbard, how many years ago, told us how much oil we had left. We've been arguing about it, but it's pretty close. We do have a good idea how much we have left. Coal, we know pretty well how much copper we have, et cetera. It's the non-renewable resources that largely go into that.
Well, I guess the reason is because the track record is very poor. On these, there have been various, like the limits to growth that have proven to be wrong.
Oh, but that was food. That's a good point. And that's a very good point that the predictions by Paul Ehrlich was we're going to have mass starvation, and then the agricultural production went up. So there, we can always relax some of those.
When Borlaug accepted his Nobel Prize, he warned that science wasn't the answer to population.
True.
And now we're getting the
I think-
agricultural runoffs and,
James, you get the last.
So I'd answer that, we're able to expand our carrying capacity. It's not a constant like it would be for other animals that don't change their environment. The problem is as we expand our carrying capacity, the environment pays that cost. So we can continue to, Jerry shows less acres. We can do hydroponics. We can have higher productivity ways of doing things. But there's this hidden cost that comes out of species going extinct.
There's a huge hidden cost, and I'm going to have the last word. The latest estimates from the UN are that 25% of all mammals, terrestrial and marine, 25% will be gone within 30 years. And that 50% of all species, terrestrial and marine, will be gone by 2100. If they're wrong by a factor of 2 or 3, we're still in trouble. There was a letter that went from the chief of the Duwamish Indians, Chief Selt, that was sent to the president. Who was the president back then? Bruce, you were probably voted for Franklin Pierce. But anyway, there's a wonderful quote in that letter that man shall surely die of loneliness of spirit if all the great beasts are gone. Much of that quality of life is the natural environment, and I think that's a good point that James made. That's the part.
Good
All
point.
right, Joe, thank you for a wonderful.
Thank you.